All right, Ace, Semiogogue. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are y'all doing?
Very,
Hey,
very
very
well.
well. Glad to be back here.
5 seconds and we stuffed it. So, just a little bit of background to this stream. Ace and I already did a previous show, his second appearance on the Jay Burden Show, about the boomer generation. And a little bit afterwards, Semiogogue said that he'd be up for a discussion on Gen X. So that's really the point of the podcast today. And what we're really trying to do is just explore the generation from both ends. Obviously, Semiogogue is a member, and then Ace and I as people whose parents are Gen X. So let's start off with just a really basic question, which is, what is your kind of exposure and relation to Generation X? I'll throw this one to you, Oliver.
Well, I am that. I am a Generation X. You want to take your pound of flesh from me? I am that. I am that thing of questionable value. Yeah, I was born into that generation, and it was my mother's milk.
So, Ace, are your parents Gen X, or is this more of an academic discussion for you?
Yes, they are Gen X. They're actually, I guess you could technically qualify them as late boomers too. So, my context to Gen X is kind of learning from them. And I actually didn't understand the generational divide for most of my life. So, whenever we would get into arguments, I didn't understand that dynamic. But kind of some of the stuff we've been saying on your show has definitely given me some more enlightenment. So, it's definitely helpful for sure.
All right. So as for me, right, I've already said my parents are Gen X, and they're prime Gen X. They were born in 75. So that places them kind of right in the middle of it. And so obviously that's not the same as kind of being around for it, but to a certain extent you kind of absorb it from your family. So Oliver, this is a more direct question for you. What would you say were the defining characteristics of Gen X when it came to childhood? How were they raised and who were their parents?
Man, well, you have a sample size of one, so you know what that yields. All kinds of question marks. And there's a complicating feature to this, which is that I really do believe that I'm not like anybody else, and I'm very special and different. However, that is the characteristic attitude of Gen X. So, yeah, each one of them really does believe that they are a special snowflake, as was so famously reflected in a Fight Club when it rolled around. Um, so, yeah, but your mileage may vary with my responses. Other people have had other experiences. So, ambient temperature, barometric pressure, and velocity may vary. So, um, the uh, the the thing I noticed was that there really were a lot of single mothers when I was coming up. There are a lot of them. I would not say they were the majority, but I would say that you probably had better than 50% that were divorced or single mothers. Maybe I'm
Well,
getting a little bit out of control with that, but certainly in the circles I moved in, you ran into lots of children who came from one parent homes or who were forced to bounce around, and also a lot of the latchkey kid stuff, where the kids came home and their single parents working at the airport or at whatever their business is, and the child is unsupervised until the parent returns from home from that period, from when school let out to when the parents got home from work.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that phrase, the latchkey kid, because that's kind of the phrase I think of most often when it comes to how Gen X was raised. Both of my parents did come from intact families, but it was not at all uncommon, between their friends and like the people in their social circles. I would agree with you. If it's not 50%, it's very close to it. And it's interesting because that was very much not the case with previous generations. I mean, that's almost redundant to say, right? But it was kind of like, at least looking at the data, which is the only thing I have, right? Again, I wasn't there. It was almost like this crescendo of as no fault divorce became first legalized and then kind of socially acceptable. And I believe that the divorce rate peaked sometime in the late 70s, early 80s at a little over 50%. It's kind of stabilized since then. But that's, if nothing else, highly formative, right?
Certainly affected me. You have a basic family pattern, and I imagine it may have some similarities. If you got primarily raised with your father, and I knew a few kids who were like that. Usually it was mostly by the mother, but there were some where they were mainly with the father. So I assume if you had, your primary exposure to the father, you could feel a little bit out of sorts. Like, for example, going to spend the night at a friend's house and staying with parents who are, a parent who, is a female. Or in my case, I'd split and go stay with a friend of mine in school who was one of three brothers, and they have a father that's taking care of them. And I'm like, damn, this is all testosterone up in here. Whereas, where I came from was the estrogen soup. So yeah, there were certainly ways in which things were a little bit off. Also, if you grew up without those without either a mother or a father around. In my case, it wasn't that they weren't around. I mean, I saw my dad every summer, most summers, and I saw him in between. He wasn't completely absent, but there's a very big difference, when the lion's share of the exposure that the kid gets is to one gender or another. So yeah, I could see where that affected how people dealt with things, and as I started to say, I'm all over the place. If you don't have a male figure around, you go and you find them. Generally I hung out with people who were older. It didn't end up being anything like a surrogate father. But there were several people, actually a chain of them, that I became friends with who were older that ended up being like mentors, serial mentors. So you end up having to reach out to areas outside the home in order to find these things. And the nature of those kinds of interactions is such that, caveat emptor, you have to be very, very careful in selecting people that you allow yourself to form an impression of, from, or through. And I was fairly successful with that, by my lights anyway. But I saw a lot of people end up screwed up, having to go outside of the family to find some kind of element that was lacking in that milieu, and then sort of stepping on their dick one way or another.
So do you think that relative lack of attention, in the sense that there was kind of that I guess like archetype of the latchkey kid, how do you think that affected you or your cohorts or kind of the people around you?
Well, we got up to all kinds of shit, obviously. And I don't know. I mean, but it depends on what kind of impression you form and what your character's like in the first place. As part of the process of maturation or whatever, you go through the phase where you first leave the female, and then you go to these larger social groups. And this is built in with, being sent to a public school, or I suppose private school, if that's the road you went. But then you have the next phase, which is sort of one way or another leaving that middle ground. You leave the home, and you're part-time, being raised by the state, and then you end up leaving that system. And the idea is it's almost like you go with a war party. You end up finding a hunting party that will take you in, and whether that's a gang, whether it's all the guys at the record shop who snottily discuss every subdivision of musical genre and thereby exclude who they do and don't hang out with, whether it's going into the military, you'll find some sort of crew that whose social requirements in forming collectives and sub-collectives you have to observe. But now I've forgotten the damn question.
Oh, well, essentially I was asking you how the lack of, I guess, parental attention affected that group, but I think that's a pretty good answer. So this one is something I think we could probably talk almost an entire show about. But if you had to say, what were the big influences, cultural, political, anything like that, on your generation in that kind of like vital period of your life, what would you say were the most important, like, I guess, events or like cultural events? Sorry, that was redundant.
No, there could be all kinds of events, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, there was definitely the idea that the 60s in which my family had participated somewhat on the early side, as I was mentioning to you before we started the discussion. They were born before the end of World War II, so they're technically silent generation. And my mother was always kind of like hippies. I don't know. She kind of dabbled and went off to Central America when she was younger to travel around and have pay bribes to Central American border guards and do that whole thing. But uh, she took an impression of the 60s, and like you guys will, I would assume, will look back at the 90s, certainly at the 80s, because I've seen enough of the fashion coming through as it's redigested and kind of barfed up again like a dog eating its own vomit. One of the old definitions that I've seen of nostalgia. There's a certain period of time that goes by where things get repackaged and rerun. So like in the 2000s, people were wearing flared jeans again. The cars basically go from round edges to square edges in 10-year cycles, and or maybe they'll find a middle ground where it's sort of square with radiused edges, but they move these things through in sequence, and people end up looking backwards to find out where they should be. So my group, I don't know if you guys are looking at the 80s and 90s. My group back in the day, in the 90s, we were looking to the 60s. So, you'd go out to smoke cigars with your friends and they'd show up in a fucking double-breasted suit and you'd be, get the hell out of here, fool. It's supposed to be a 3-button, and then you'd argue over whether or not you'd button the middle button or the top button. So you kind of looked back to old 60s things, narrow ties and this whole kind of thing. So I guess what I'm saying there is that it looks like a 20 or a 30-year cycle for, regurgitating it and chewing back through it again. And so we were reinterpreting the 60s. And of course, my mother and father had both taken their own impressions of the 60s. So I felt that there had to be something like that that you followed up on, some sense of how you two could find your way and stake a claim. One of the big ones was rebellion. I didn't have to explore that because it came very, very naturally to me, in the sense that I did not think anyone was fit to tell me anything. And it was so consistently borne out by how stupid the people who were supposed to be in a position to educate me were. So for me, what I picked up from that whole sort of 60s background was like, travel across the world and find secret wisdom, which you see starting with the Beats. Probably they just wanted to bang peach asses on little boys, going to Tangier or whatever, like Bill Burroughs or Allen Ginsberg, to write poems about cocks and balls and cocks and balls, but you also had this stuff like, some of the artwork experimentation of Brian Geisen. Burroughs did leave an impression with his writing. Likewise, Kerouac, some of those people who came back from the war. I don't know, Kerouac, I think, was in the Merchant Marine, but you had a bunch of people who came back during that time period and they wandered the earth. Or like, what's his name from the damned Rolling Stones? Is it Brian Jones, I want to say, who died in North Africa? So
That's an ace question.
Yes, that is. I thought he drowned, though.
Yeah. Well, one way or another, he died. And it was while traveling the world. I think he had gone off to record the master musicians of Jojuka or something. I have it all filed away with a bunch of Temple of Psychic Youth bullshit from back then. Anyway, I'm talking too long. The gist, I guess, of what I'm saying is that we each had to look back to the templates that had been established, and you kind of pull one down off a shelf and decide what aspects of it you want to go explore. So for me, it was to chase skirts, get fucked up, read all kinds of intense stuff, go looking for esoteric lore, and to travel to faraway places to find some kind of secret wisdom. And I'd like to say that was not, strictly the 60s kind of thing, but it was definitely one of those themes. And to be honest, in retrospect, I probably took that down from the shelf quite a bit, from the available options.
So it's interesting kind of looking back on the 90s to a certain degree as like an echo of the 60s, because listening to my dad talk, and he was very involved in kind of the 90s music scene, and he talks about things that you could almost imagine his dad talking about. It was Woodstock too. It was kind of this idea of like everything was the same ish if you just squinted your eyes. And that's not his words, it's kind of my words listening to two generations.
Mm.
But it is odd that almost like that is the mold for rebellion. That's the way you do it, right? Like you get out and you protest. If you don't protest, Stonewall or the draft, you're protesting. What were they protesting in the 90s in Portland again? It was some trade deal. I can't remember. Something like that. Or if you're not smoking weed and, dancing around naked to, Jimi Hendrix, you're doing it to Nirvana. But in a weird way, it was a darker echo,
There was
because
a definite darker echo to your point about Nirvana. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, because that was the days of heroin, and self-destruction really unfolded in terms of drug use. You got the major flood of meth, and then you had this certain phase where I remember it distinctly. When I was growing up, people would save their lunch money and buy acid, and then on the weekend drop a hit of it, or get some weed with their friends to smoke at the kegger. But then there was this whole phase, as I had already left high school without completing it and left home when I was 16, and I think it was when I was about 17 or so, just heroin, 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 heroin everywhere. So yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, definitely there was a darker echo, a more self-destructive echo.
well, and that's very much like, and I'm no music historian, but the first Woodstock is kind of famous as this, wonderful summer of love. But if you talk about the second one, it's this like horrible, like I think there were a bunch of rapes occurred and like multiple people died. It was just this like horrible dark event. And it's odd because I feel like we, at least from the outside looking in, that kind of that kind of almost like framework of the dark echo of the 60s, I feel like kind of fits. So I'm curious, Ace, what is your opinion of like Gen X classics that have kind of stood the test of time and are kind of still like relevant to people our age?
Oh, well, Gen X specifically, like obviously I'm not a fan of a lot of these guys, but the grunge scene really seems to have been the template that kind of continue on into the alternative scene. Like obviously the all the Seattle bands, Nirvana and Pearl Jam. I'm not fans of these bands, but obviously in terms of influence, that it really hasn't been replicated since. And I don't know if that's due to lack of work ethic that some of the Gen X was able to kind of persevere in spite of not having that parental guidance. I mean, I give them credit for having that kind of work ethic, but as far as like timeless music, I think it that kind of stuff really, it's less about the music itself and the fact that they were able to kind of have a decentralized take on the music industry and kind of step away from the NTV model that they have been accustomed to. That's just me reading the stuff after the fact in retrospect. I don't know if that's like totally correct, but I just think that them having sort of an active role in the music industry outside of the mainstream, that is something that I think has stuck today. The sort of indie scene that you see in the 2000s, the emo bands, I think a lot of that owes to the alternative scene, even if a lot of the music isn't as memorable as like a Led Zeppelin album, for instance.
Well, I definitely agree that in the same way that kind of the 60s set the tone for rebellion, the 90s set the tone for what an alternative, quote unquote, like capital A alternative lifestyle was, right? Like I live in a college town, and the alternative kids, and that is a scene that I put in as many quotes as you possibly can. Uh, it's absurd, right? Like it's the same look. Like it's out of time, but it's the same sense of, at least from their perspective, of rebellion, right? And it's the same, like it's almost like code. Like now we're 30 years in, and that's still how you say, well, I'm mad at my parents and I'm doing my own thing. It's the tattoos might be slightly different, but it's still the same idea. So
Yeah,
Semiogogue,
scribbles and pencil art instead of tribal. Yeah, they
right,
look
right,
like like
exactly.
somebody's drawn on school notebook instead of something dragged out of the jungle of Borneo.
That's a good way to put it, right? So there are a few moments, right, that kind of really like pushed me to start an interview show. And there were mostly those moments where I was sitting there screaming at a screen, and it was not even necessarily all bad, just times where I felt like I wanted to ask a question. And one of those, and Semiogogue, I'm not sure if you even remember this, but I think it was AA's Christmas stream. And you were talking about
epic long stream. Yeah.
yeah, right. And you were talking about kind of going through, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth here, but I'm paraphrasing off of 6 months of memory. You were talking about how there was kind of this period of hedonism in your life, and you likened it to the kind of the symbol in fiction of the fairy meal, right? That it's this wonderful meal that feels like it goes on forever, and then all of a sudden you wake up and it's dust in your mouth and you're 100 years old. The Rip Van Winkle archetype, if you will. And that, to me, that kind of seems to be kind of like, I guess, the symptoms of being the first generation who was born after the sexual revolution. So do you think that that's true? And how do you think being the first major generation after the 60s affected you personally and then also your generational cohort?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that no matter what, everyone is going to have that moment where at some point, and I mean, if they have any fucking lights on, they're going to come to a point where they look back and they say, was it all worth it? And deep inside themselves, they'll hear some laughter saying, fuck no. You wasted it. That's just something that happens. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be accurate. It's a natural part of looking back and saying, was it all worth it? So whether you're Gen X or not, I'm here to share the good news with you, gentlemen. You too will have to look back on, the road you've taken and the path you've walked. And, you'll have to look at the lines formed in your face and think to yourself, damn, I got those for a reason. When my mother was saying, if you keep your face like that way, it'll stay that way. I don't know if parents still say that, but it's shown to be very, very true. There's a certain furrowed brow and sneer that have given, and squint lines from doing this a lot. And my face holds that now forever. And I'll tell you another thing, if you get good at it, you can read those lines on people's faces. And thereby determine, how they've held themselves. Anyway, so it's going to happen to all of you, regardless of your generation. But yeah, I think what happened with the 60s was that there was supposed to be some kind of sexual revolution. It was really less important that any of the parents had gone through it. And more important that it was understood to have happened. And so the general wisdom, was let your kids do whatever. Like now the business of trying to encourage women to, for example, cut off their breasts to the extent that they even remove the nipples in order to get it flat. And they've just got a weird, stitch across the front of their chest. Our version of that was health class. It's all natural. It's okay, but probably you should wait until after you're 18 because you don't want any unwanted pregnancies. That same sort of dilation of what's permissible or pushing of the Overton window in this respect had happened. It just hadn't gone as far as, cut your genitals off, cut your breasts off, take hormones from another sex, and yet it still yielded this result that there was more license. And again, I don't think I don't think that the vast majority of parents at that time had ever been through any kind of crazy sexual revolution. I mean, surely they had more sexual partners than the preceding generation, most likely, but I think it was more the worldview at the time. The spirit of that age was let it go, and yeah. And boy, did we. Enormous amounts of my energy were poured into chasing women around, and very much so for the guys that I hung out with. It wasn't all of them, and I can distinctly remember a few friends of mine back in the day who were like, I remember I was talking to a friend of mine in Turkey, and I turned to him and I'm like, hey man, let's go out and pick up some women. And he's like, I pick up women. I go home, I have a drink, maybe I eat something, I lie down in bed, my girlfriend gets in and I pick her up, and I'm like, what? Why? So there was definitely that idea that you would go out and chase it, drink deeply from the cup or whatever. Um, so that was there. It was a reality for me and many of my friends. It was not the rule. There were certainly exceptions, but it was also much more relaxed. I mean, it wasn't as relaxed, for example, as trying to get it on in the 60s or whatever, because, when I can't remember when it was, but roughly as I was coming through high school and out of high school, AIDS hit. And so nobody had this sense that they could just go out and screw around. They were, people who are screwing around a lot would be worried, and oh God, this is the new thing, with monkeypox, COVID, AIDS, they push various concerns about plague through of various kinds. So it was not like absolute license. But on the other hand, you did have all kinds of people who pretty much assumed, oh, that's just what high school kids do. You just throw in rocks at the window to try to get the girl to come out. They think, oh, it's just kind of like the old days. But it wasn't always like the old days. There's one particular experience I'll share and then stop. But there was this girl who I thought was, she had her moments. I didn't know about her until a friend of mine told me about her and said he used to go throw rocks in her window and she would just come down and do whatever in the middle of the night. And and so he called her up because he knew her personally, and she just came over. And then I figured out where she lived, so I threw rocks at her window. And then one time after a party, I was like, "Hey guys, let's go, man. There's this not guys, my one friend. I'm like, there's this girl I know, and you just throw rocks at her window." And we went way out into the suburbs to this little McMansion, and we're running up through the bushes as only narrow ass beta males can do. You can't catch them. They will climb your fences. They will fuck your chickens. And I got up to the house and started throwing rocks at the window, and there was no answer. And I'm like, damn, I mean, maybe somebody was here first. And just at that moment, I heard some noise coming up the driveway, and me and my buddy, we ran off into the bushes and hid. And two other dudes showed up and started throwing, pine bark chips at her window or whatever. So that kind of thing was going on. There was a whole lot more license, and it seemed to be endorsed as long as you didn't talk to your parents about it. They just had an idea of what it must be, and it couldn't be that bad, so don't talk about it and everything would be just fine. You're just I don't know. It could be different if you weren't growing up with a single mother and you had a dad, who was like hardcore about like, you must be in by this time or you will die. That kind of thing probably didn't happen as much. But for single parent kids, whether it was male or female, they were off working so much that, you invariably ended up with a fair amount of time to yourself.
So one of the things that I can understand rationally, but it's hard for me to kind of get my head around, is what was it like kind of growing up in the shadow of kind of, I guess, like the constant risk of just nuclear holocaust? The idea that any day could be the last one. Was that something that people thought about, talked about, or was that just kind of something like distant floating around in the ether?
That was reinforced through school drills where you'd climb up under the desk and they'd do a test. And if there was they'd run a little siren for a second or not, they'd just do it at a particular time. And the principal would come on the PA system and tell you what's going on. And you would climb up under your desks and, hunch down. It worked as a drill. It wasn't just for that, to be fair. It was also if there was a tornado or something, if there was a tornado, those little desks would have been flying everywhere, cutting people to chaff. But anyway, it was there, and I remember feeling it, and it also got pushed. I think it was in Britain, they did threads, and in the US, they did the day after or some shit like that. And it was a big deal. And I remember I did go to one protest when I decided that I was going to be an anarchist, and yeah, I put a Circle A on the back of my jacket under where it said Black Sabbath. And then these kids showed up with a bunch of flyers about some sort of protest that was going to happen. This was when I was sophomore in high school. And we all went out and we did die-ins. We marched into the restaurant and fell on the ground and said, "Oh, we all died at once." The same stupid leftist
Right, right.
crap that you see today. But the thing is that by about, after doing it once at age 15, I was like, yeah, no. Um, but that was in part driven, to come back to your question, by this whole business of having a sense of anxiety. And it was there, it was created, it was used as a lever quite effectively, in a variety of ways, whether consciously or unconsciously, by all kinds of powers. And then it just went away. It all just went away. Everything, that whole thing just deflated suddenly. That boogeyman just went poof, like one of these, things that sits in your front yard that has a little blower to keep it up there, and it just seems to whip around, and then someone cuts the power and it just goes poof. The whole thing just dropped out because things shifted with the Soviet Union, and the Iron Curtain, in theory, came down. Now, the reality was that we were all much more at risk of going in the dark at that time than ever before, with all kinds of weapons being decommissioned and all the attendant instability. But most people did not know that. And the next thing you know, it all just sort of rolled forward until it was, we're all going to be surfing the web in Timbuktu, and it's the World Wide Web, Mosaic browsers, and then Mondo 2000 comes out, and it's all one global village. And that held, you had the Reagan boom stuff that had a lot of the Cold War fears with it, and then it all started to fall apart, and you rolled into this phase with Clinton, and it was, everything opened up, man. So yeah, so I guess through high school, you sort of thought about it and heard about it, but by the time I was in high school, it was starting to wind down. And then through the 90s, I mean, did people even ever talk about nuclear war? I mean, it pretty much disappeared. It wasn't even a thought. No one thought about that.
At most, looking back, it was like a hackneyed plot device in like B-level action movies, right? XYZ generic terrorist stole a dirty bomb. But even then, it never seemed
still
particularly
had
serious. Right. So this is somewhat related, and this is one of those things that I am just fascinated by looking back, which is, do you remember, I guess, the kind of, and they weren't completely linked, but they seem to be roughly, occurring at the same time, which is one, that the Satanic Panic, and two, kind of like the rise of like the serial killer as an icon. Do you remember those things?
Oh yeah, I was there. Yeah. Satanic Panic I knew a lot about because I was way into my woo and all my occult stuff at that time. And so, yeah, it was all about, all these people are, also I played D&D. So, I heard the Tom Hanks made for television film Mazes and Monsters, about how you're going to wander in the sewers. Like, I was there. I was like, Mom, this isn't fair. They're talking about demon worship and advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and it'll make me crazy. And Mazes and Monsters is a dumb name anyway, Mom. She's like, pay attention to your homework, and you've got gifted class tomorrow. This kind of crap. So I was there for both of those, and it was a twofold kind of thing. There was the Satanic Panic, but it rode on the shoulders, or shouldn't say that, it overlapped with the D&D as a threat to your children too. And all of that overlapped with the Washington Wives and Tipper Gore, and people like Dee Snider and Frank Zappa saying that they were going to, they're going to push back against the Washington Wives. And the lyric labeling with rap was coming through at that time. There was a massive sort of last gasp, sort of straight boomercon push to impose social conservatism, which was very much the way in which that side of things was characterized, and I think pretty fairly so at the time. So yeah, I was there for that. What was it? It was the Satanic Panic, and what was the other one?
The other one was just like the kind of the rise of the
serial
killer.
Yeah, that really came in. I mean, there were I mean, that was going on before me, where what's his name?
Right.
The prosecutor who prosecuted Buscoglia, I can't remember his damn name. It's some Italian out in California. who wrote the book about the Manson murders. You know, so you'd
Mhm.
have girls in high school who'd read the Manson murders book and get all into the lurid details, and but it really came in, I think, around the time of Natural Born Killers, which kind of popularized that. And then there were a couple Echo movies, like that one with Jennifer Lopez and Nick Nolte. There were a few that came out that were of that type. Um, yeah, it's where Nick Nolte, I think, is some sort of abusive figure, and Jennifer Lopez is some sort of trapped Latina. They didn't have Latinx at the time, thank God. Yeah, but it came through, and it was pretty hardcore. Actually, I was just going through some boxes of my old stuff. My friend died, and I went through some of his stuff, and I knew him at that time, and he had done consulting for the FBI related to Occult Watch and all these other things. And so I actually found it. I should have. I didn't know you were going to ask about this, or I would have pulled it. But there's one of his documents that's basically a guide to occult symbols and meaning for law enforcement that he contributed to, and most of it they were way off, man. They had no idea what was going on. The police couldn't understand what. I mean, how many cops are going to be able to distinguish between, on the one hand, New World Voodoo or Santeria versus Pontos Riscados or Condomble or all these Orisha system derivatives out of West Africa? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, how are they going to distinguish between like Crowley style OTO ritual magic versus like ritual magic light with Llewellyn publications, or like Gardnerian Wicca versus Janet and Stewart Farrar? I mean, they had no idea what was going on or how to deal with it. However, I will say this: it was not totally insane, because on the one hand, you had them saying, "Oh yeah, the occultists, they kept acolytes in the basement and they were using them as breeders." You know, they would just truly invent insane hysterical shit, just like the left does now.
Right, right.
However, there was a legitimate reason to be concerned about a lot of stuff, because you had, for example, this guy Costanza in Brownsville and Matamoros, and he only came to light because he ended up kidnapping someone who I believe was the son of a senator or a congressman, if not a federal one, a state one. And because that kid was important enough and disappeared, U.S. law enforcement got on it. But this dude was making Ewo Okes and Ngongas. Basically, he came out of Palamonte, Condomble. I think it's Condomble. But he came out of one of these West African traditions where you kill people, torture them to death to bind their spirit, and you fill like black metal cauldrons with their bones and bits of bird skulls and all the animals that you like put into it to try to make a sentient entity out of that. And he was making Ewa-okes too, where they want to kill a white person to bind his soul, because under their lore, they would follow orders better. And if you just look at Matamoros and Brownsville and the murders with Costanzas, I believe it's Costanza, if I'm not mistaken. And so those kind of things were going on too. There was a bunch of sort of weird shit going on.
Right. There was something dark going on, and maybe the diagnosis was wrong, but the concern was not. So this is one thing. It's just slightly more lighthearted, I guess, from a certain perspective. But can you explain the children on milk cartons thing? Because I've heard my parents say that and have no context for it.
You don't know about kids on milk cartons?
I mean, I understand the general concept, but not the significance, I guess.
Wow. So they don't, I guess that's your way of gently telling me they don't do that anymore. Once upon a time, this would have been before the internet. The idea was that if a child was missing, you would want to let people know, so that if he was seen and recognized, the law enforcement could be called or whatever. But now that I think back about it, knowing what I do now, it seems like more hysterical terror generating bullshit. Who's on what basis are they going to assume that this random picture sent to a random region that may or may not correlate with where the child disappeared, with a distance of 5 years, and it's flexo printing on the surface of Tetra Pak? How accurate an image are you going to get? And also, it seems kind of weird to me that they would choose milk, which is the thing that the parents buy for their children that's going to go on the table with the cereal. So every time mom sets it on the table, she's going to get this flutter of hysteria. And oh my God, the kid might be missing. I don't know. Maybe it was well meaning. Um, but these days, when in doubt, I assume someone was fucking me. So yeah, basically, you just, as you must know, you bought a milk carton, and on it was a black and white photo of some poor missing or exploited child that they couldn't find, and even at the breakfast table, you could not escape the sense of, I guess, impending doom, or your mother being, filled with the notion that her child might be stolen. They really did push hysteria in some strange ways, and what's so odd is that now that I think about it, they did it primarily with the right.
So it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the things I've always wondered is, well, why did Gen X get so cynical? And do you think it had anything to do with the fact that there was so much impending doom that never materialized, that it just kind of resulted in this, like, well, I'm not going to believe you another time type of attitude? Or where else do you think that cynical attitude that's kind of typifies that generation came from?
Yeah, I don't know that. I guess I'd have to chew on that one, because the idea that we're all going to glow in the dark tomorrow, and we're all going to be dying from radiation poisoning, and being ass raped by roving bands of cannibals, and then being told that it's all one global village. Yeah, I could see where there's a disconnect there. And maybe that played into it a little bit, but my impression is less that it was because of being told all the time that something terrible was going to happen. I think, and this is in retrospect, I didn't form the impression at the time, but in retrospect, it seems to me that it had more to do with no fixed points of orientation. So, like, there's something I'm actually working on, because animals, as they move along a path, I won't go way into this, but they mark their route. Like, you take a dog out walking, and he's going to want to refresh his scent signatures as he does his territorial marking thing. And those marks along a route that tell you what course you're going and where you're coming from, where you're going, that allow you to orient within your space. That can range from scent marks to what we call landmarks. As you pass an object, you know that as you go past the big oak tree, you turn right by the stream, right? These kinds of things. As you go through paths in life, you have the idea that you can see certain markers that indicate to you where you're going. But I think for Gen X, it was very much like the experience of driving on a highway today. If you do a regular commute, there are doubtless going to be routes that you travel in your car as you're coming back to your place or heading out to work in the morning. And you're going to see these billboards, because those billboards are fixed positions along your route. Those are your landmarks. However, the fucking content of that position along your route has its significance shifted with whatever the cycle is for re-upping the outdoor advertising, whatever their contract length is. So I put that out there as a metaphor. I don't know how useful it's going to be, but it's going to, what I'm trying to convey is that you'd move along a path and you would look for landmarks around you, and they had certain fixed positions where you would be told where you were in life, or on the journey of life, like nel mezzo cammina di nostra vita, from Dante. In the middle of this life of mine, I found myself in a dark wood. You're walking on a road, right, as you move through life. And for Gen X, it feels like there were fixed positions where you would look for your symbols, but the symbols were changed out all the fucking time. They changed their valence all the time. So, in the course of, a year, I guess, and this is more of a symptom than a cause, but, it would go from you really liked it, to it was disgusting, but you talked about it to mock it, ironically. And you're just constantly surrounded by changing symbols, and symbols with sort of inverted values. And so the result of that is, what do you measure by? You have to look at everything with skepticism. I mean, I thought it couldn't get worse, but now with the whole trans thing, it actually got fucking worse. But for my generation, it's kind of like, what are you navigating by? What is the point of orientation? And they kept sliding it and moving it and smearing it and shifting it. And even so, we had a much easier time than people who came afterwards, because we got financially raped by the dot-com boom and the Y2K boom and early real estate housing crashes, and then the big one in like 2005 and 2006. We got screwed too. The thing is that it actually kind of came back online again. So we got screwed a couple times, but we had a couple times to rush in and like try again. Whereas I guess from about, I don't know, mid 2000s forward, it's just been a cascading series of suboptimal fuck ups where, you have to wonder how anybody can put any money aside or anything. Anyway, the point is, I think it has more to do, and this is a major focus of mine, is signification value in your environment of the things that you use to orient yourself. And if you're think about if there's signs around you that, and I'm using this metaphorically because it might be about how you're supposed to deal with women, or it might be about what is a good thing or a bad thing to do to make money, or what you should be satisfied with in terms of how much you make after you graduate, all these different things in life where you'd expect to have some sort of fixed index point. They were constantly shifting. And if you take a look at an animal that doesn't have control over its environment, you take a cat out of the house and then have a dog over and then let the dog out, and the cat comes back in and it's got a whole new set of scent indicators. That means its territory has been threatened. It no longer knows which routes are safe. You get deeply skeptical about what anything means. And so you take a pose of total distance from all of it that I think yields that irony. The end. I'm sorry that was long.
No, that was really well put. And to me, and I don't mean to just skewer this relatively artificial age cohort, but it seems like the boomers, to a certain extent, preached that doctrine of there being no landmarks, right? It's like, oh, do whatever you want. Like everything is this kind of like changeable like facade. But to a certain degree, they didn't really live it out. Like when it came to their lives, they lived very much how their parents did. But that's not how they raised their children. So to a certain extent, it was almost this kind of like, it's like when it's delayed onset to a certain degree. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think if you look at the boomers, they were the immigrants to this new utopian love fest. Imagine all the people. They were the first to arrive, and they got to like wander around and think about how beautiful everything could be if they just imagined it. And now they could do it. ERA hadn't gone through, but they still had their old ERA buttons. And
right.
And they felt like, this really could happen. We're the first ones who are going to try it. And all we have to do is give our children that freedom. We can't stifle their creativity. You can be anything. And, and maybe it was different. Probably it was very different for a lot of people who had their dads around, because then you'd get the discipline side as well. And I think plenty of Gen X people got discipline from their parents. I didn't. So I think there's this aspect where the first generation, very much like with immigrants, they kind of want to do it. They still have a lot of their old traditions, but they keep an open mind about everything. They say, this younger generation can do whatever because they're going to have to acclimate, and it's all just a big, wonderful melting pot anyway. And I think the true dislocation comes with being the first generation. And I feel like the Gen Xers were the first generation that grew up in the stinking cesshole of what was coming. Still, by comparison, it was way better. You could still go out into the country and there'd still be country people alive who tell you old country stories from a world that you guys don't even hear about it. There was still kind of the mind your own business and don't expect the same. There was the idea that, within certain constraints, if you weren't like in an inner city somewhere, you could, have an argument with a cop, these kinds of things. There were all and they still had Trans Ams, for fuck's sake. you know. So I mean, I guess they probably have them today, but I'm talking about the proper old, or you know, like a Firebird with a T-top. You know, it was a different world. So we saw it, and we didn't have it as bad off as subsequent generations have had it. But I think that we were the first ones who were really thrown into it fully. And so it's like the boomers, given when all the manipulations came online and reached a crescendo in the mid 60s or whatever, you know, around about 64 or whatever it was. They had not been fully raised on it. We were the first ones that were fully raised on it. However, our parents still had the unconscious impressions of the previous generation, and so we still had some structure, just of the native kind. You know,
Right, right.
you're not trying to reconstruct the language from a few leftover notebooks and some recordings of the last speaker who died 50 years ago. It was still a living language. So you could still form an impression of what had come before and kind of take it in osmotically. But with subsequent generations, I've seen that's disappeared like that weird thing. Everybody today fucking hammers on their T's and their D's in weird ways. Like they're growing up in a world where they've never heard proper English spoken, and they quite properly want to speak it correctly, but they'll say, and they don't want to go, no, I didn't. Right. So instead, they overemphasize it, but they do it based on how they think it should sound. They're not doing it based on having actually heard the model. And when I hear all these young people speak, I'm like, what the fuck? They're like, yes, I didn't. I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave. Like, it sounds fucking crazy. If you grew up hearing how people actually spoke proper English, this attempt, which is laudable, of young people to again try to speak proper English, it's so fucking strained and stilted. It's weird, man. Weird.
Well,
Anyway, I'm not
I-
answering the question anymore.
no. You did a good job. But I really like your model of describing it as kind of immigrants to a foreign land, right? So if we can extend this model a little bit, right? The boomers were the first ones off the boat. And when they got there, they found out that, you know, the new world wasn't full of gold with, you know, oysters the size of your head everywhere. Turns out there were other people there and they weren't quite happy to see you. You know, the model breaks down a little bit if you extend it, but I do like that one, right? So another Gen X icon from a certain perspective, uh, Ted Kaczynski has a model that I really like. It's a pretty simple one, right? But it's the power process. And essentially he makes the argument that the breakdown in modern society is essentially people's inability to engage in the power process, which is doing things that really and truly affect your life. So for instance, in the type of society he would propose, that was the basic necessity of how do I feed myself? You know, will I protect myself from wild animals? That kind of like lizard brain mentality. But he talks about how we can kind of substitute that with surrogate activities, and those kind of change depending on like what type of person you are. But what he says is that in many ways, the political kind of where you go in your life is a version of that original power process. And so one of the things I've noticed just kind of looking at society is it seems like to a certain degree, Gen X never got their chance to exercise the power process, right? They only got the option to have surrogate activities. Like if you look at the people in charge, it's not age stratified. Like you'd expect by now, at least, that Gen X would be some percentage of that, you know, higher than it is. And maybe some of that's just simple demographics. There aren't a lot of Gen Xers compared to other age groups. But it does seem that kind of like normal chain of continuity of people retiring and being replaced, that changed, or the pace of that changed. So do you agree with that?
I think there's some truth to that, but there are Gen X people who got into positions of power. Um, so yes, there's some truth to that, but it's not like a bunch of disenfranchised people floating, you know, out in limbo with the unbaptized children. Like there is, I mean, it depends. They got into positions that were, and even I did, that were pretty successful. But the thing is that they, at least speaking again, this is heavily influenced by my own experience. So, you know, um, they got into a thing where there was, it's almost like ant and grasshopper shit from Aesop's fables, where why would you save anything? Because you were, I mean, like, I was not out there specifically thinking I don't ever want a family. I just put that behind my, it's going to be an epitaph at this point on my gravestone, unless I can course correct. But as it stands, if I die on my tombstone, it's going to say unrealistic expectations. But if I can pull up out of that nosedive, maybe something different will be there. But I was not looking for a family. I was looking for a perfect woman. Ridiculous. Where, and am I a perfect man? However, on the other side of that, there might have been a family or something of that sort, but there was always something else you had to sort out first. You had to do this, you had to find a proper woman, you have to be making X amount or living in your proper environment. Or in my case, my big thing was I want to make money doing what I enjoy, which, I got pretty close to, and did for a while, but not in such a fashion that you could put anything away and save it for later. So that's what I mean about this whole thing of it being sort of like the ant and the grasshopper, because lots of Gen X people have gotten into all kinds of positions of power, but do they build a legacy for themselves? Do they make anything that stays? And that, I think, is where we have performed most poorly. I'll add just one last thing, which is that with all the transhumanism crap and with the extension of life, which we were enjoying up until fairly recently, now it seems to be dipping again. Buckle your seatbelts. It's only natural that you would see people who got into power clinging to it for longer. So I'm not entirely sure that we're not going to see. It's, what it's just like the boomers and their crew are like parents. How do I say this? You have to get older or you're not going to have seen this, but you'll see people who are like 65 and 70 years old who've been waiting for their parents to die so they can inherit, but their parents don't fucking die. So they're like 95 years old. So you've got like this 60-year-old who's thinking, oh, well, eventually they'll die and I'll inherit and I'll get to enjoy all the largesse of the family, but they never fucking die. So, and I'm not endorsing this point of view. I'm in fact mocking it, as will become apparent for anyone who doesn't understand. But there's something of that going on with like the Nancy Pelosi's and the rest of the octogenarian lizard people, vermin, who occupy the halls of power. I'm not entirely convinced that we're not going to see some Gen X cohort from like age 75 forward step in to assume the reins of power, and they'll do so from like some few of them from age 75 to like 95. And you guys are going to be saddled with them. So there's some of that where if everybody lives longer, you're like, damn it, mommy won't give me what I wanted and she's keeping all of it for herself. But you're hearing that shit out of the mouth of someone who's like 65. So there are terrors undreamed of that might confront all y'all. Luckily, I'll be dead before they get too bad.
Well, thanks for that note of comfort, Oliver. So Ace, I feel bad. This has been essentially you on a live stream watching me talk to Oliver. But so this kind of dovetails neatly into what I want to talk to next, which is Gen X as parents. So doing a little bit of research on this, which means talking to my friends, it's kind of apparent that there are a few broad generalities about Gen X parents, which there's a positive side, which is that Gen X parents tend to be friends with their children. And there's a certain amount of that that's positive. And I'd say that's accurate. Like my father and I, and part of this is aided by the fact that he's not too much older than I am, right? In a grand scheme of things, we are friends. But in many cases, thankfully not in mine, that's paired with the helicopter parent, right? In the sense that Gen X tended to have relatively few children and invest in those children to an insane degree. And I wonder if that was almost kind of and this is me just kind of speculating, it was a way to kind of compensate for the lack of attention that they maybe received. But I think that archetype of the helicopter parent is a distinctly Gen X one. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ace?
Yes, I think it absolutely is. Correct me if Oliver, the Nature Boy, WWE. What's that guy's name? I'm blanking on it.
Oh man, AA would know. Who was Ric Flair? Was that
Yeah, who's Ric
Nature Boy?
Flair? Yes, Ric Flair. The relationship with, I mean, not to be cynical like Gen X, but I feel like what happened with his son is kind of the perfect example of what the Gen X attitude is in the world of parenting, which is, treating them, not wanting to cross over into that authority figure, because I think they've resented that kind of parenting mentality. And so what it leads to is kind of giving your son everything he wants, even when it reaches the levels of excess. So I think you're right. I think Gen X basically invented that. And I think it has to do with what you guys were talking about earlier, just refusing, like what Aaron McIntyre talks about a lot with people not wanting to grow up. And so I think that mentality kind of translates into the parent world. Even when you come of age and it's time for you to take up that responsibility, it's that refusal to confront that untapped territory. You want to stay in this level of independence, and one of the restraints of parenthood is recognizing your limitations and kind of confining yourself in this way. But I think that goes against the Gen X spirit, and so that's why you see a lot of the friendship. I was reading also the not just friendship, but this negotiation. You don't punish your kids, you don't spank your kids, you concede their framework and see if you can kind of work around that. It's this very like diplomatic way of parenting, which I just have to assume is a modern thing. There's no way that, you tell this to someone, if you could go back in time and tell this to other people, they would think this is ridiculous. But I think it's very exclusive to the Gen X mindset.
Well, and it's odd because I was kind of the oldest in my parents' cohort of friends as far as it came to children, right? I think the next my parents had one friend who had children who were, I think, 4 or 5 years younger than I was, right? So I not to say I had a perfect vantage point, but I had a better one, right? Because I was kind of watching how my parents raised their kids, and the dynamic of an adult reasoning with a child who's just melting down is absurd. Like it is, even as a relatively young child, it's like, what are you doing? Clearly this is not working. This is not a negotiation. You're dealing with essentially an unreasoning animal. And obviously, like, I love children, but they're not well known for their capacity to reason. But it was almost like it was this idea that, well, this is what good people do, right? And this is also when you see at least in my mind, right, the idea that like spanking a child is a deeply evil thing. That it's a sign of like some type of like
It's
personal
backwards.
moral failing, right? And you both saw it in kind of broad cultural attitudes, and also just in like, it was a relatively common news story in the mid 2000s for celebrities to get essentially proto canceled for spanking their children. Like, I remember there were a couple running. I wasn't big into sports. My dad watched football from time to time, right? But I do remember that a running back on one of his teams got suspended for spanking a child. And it was such, even at the time, I thought it was a very, very odd thing.
If I could just say real quick, I also think that attitude is whoops.
Sorry, I think
Anyways,
I've
go
messed
on,
up
go
your
on,
audio,
Steve.
Ace. Just keep going.
Yeah. I forgot what I was gonna say actually.
Something about the attitude of not being interested in striking your children.
Right. That whole just wanting to negotiate over laying down the law, but something. Not sure. I'll get back to it, but
Yeah,
you
we'll
guys can
jump
go ahead.
in when it comes back. I have two things. One's an observation, one's a question. The observation is that I remember when I got busted. Well, how old was I? Got to look back quite far, lads. It was certainly early years of middle school or late elementary school. I tried to pocket. They had one of these cool little packs for GI Joe action figures where you could like buy extra guns and shit. So you know how your action figures had the little hand and you could pop things into it. I don't know if they still have that. Y'all's action figures probably have fucking rainbow flippers, but in my day, you could stick guns in them and things. And so they had one of these like G.I. Joe power packs where you could like buy a bunch of different guns that you could put in their hands. So I tried to steal it at this like K&B Toy and Hobby, and some clever dude caught me at like age 9 or whatever it was, by looking through the two-way mirror, which I had no exposure to. And I remember got in huge trouble with my mother, and understandably, and should have, trying to steal shit, but what she gave me as a punishment was that I wasn't allowed to go out for like a week or 2 weeks or whatever it was, and I had to read. So she piled up all the shit. Only one I remember that was in the list, there's probably shit like The Velveteen Rabbit, The Year of the Whale, like all kinds of almost 60s type, and it wasn't from the 60s. It's stuff probably printed later, but it was the idea that it would expand my mind and force me to read, so that my penitential period should be productive in some sense, where I became a better reader. So there was a little bit of that negotiation, at least from my mother's side. My brother didn't get that, having been raised with my father, where I think there were still spankings. So all I'm trying to say is I'm not sure that it entirely came in with Gen X. And then here's my next question for you. None of you within your age cohort have your parents try to negotiate with you now? The iron fist of discipline comes down upon you?
So, and maybe I can give you a minute. Sorry, Ace, I know I've just been mercilessly persecuting you on this podcast. But at least for me, I had two very different parents. So my dad was not particularly interested in negotiating with me. He wasn't particularly strict. He was basically like, look, as long as you're here, as long as you're not doing anything bad, and as long as you're not failing out of school, you'll figure it out, right? My mom was a little bit more of the helicopter parent, but there was a whole different dynamic going on. But at least for me, and that's because I think that my dad was just uninterested in something unless it mattered. And when it mattered, it mattered. There was no negotiations, but it was kind of a situation where as long as it wasn't kind of a core issue, it was up to me. I was kind of a free range child.
The king was still sleeping beneath the mountain, but if there was a great crisis, he would wake from his centuries long slumber and say no.
Definitely. Yes. So what do you have to say, Ace?
Yeah, I think you and I may have had the same parents, because it was definitely the same playbook. Even my father being more conservative leaning, and as you said, my mom was the helicopter parent. To bring back what I was going to say originally was, even among the most conservative people in Gen X, the idea that giving your kids a choice in everything was seen as this neutral thing. And like you said earlier, that's what a good person does, is just providing options, in every facet, even in religion, even, stuff that's fundamental. There always has to be a choice. And I think it harkens back to Gen X wanting to pass down the independence that they've reaped the rewards from, even when it's excessive. The only thing that doesn't change is people have to have a choice in what they're doing. And so I would argue that even providing that option is excessive in itself. But that's just something that I've noticed through my experience. Even a quote unquote right wing person in Gen X, there is still that left wing framework that they can't really shake out of, it seems like.
Oh yeah, always choice, option, and to be fair, I can see a little bit of value in that. However, I would imagine that you'd have to pull back if you find it's not working, like if you have a certain kind of child. That's what I hate about, your Dr. Spock books or your diets or all the other fucking fads that come through, is that a pregnancy is going to be different, a relationship is going to be different, a set of circumstances is going to be different. It's the universalism that irritates me, when you have to apply particularism in all the cases. See, everybody wants to carry some kind of like little ideological spirit catcher that they can look at everything through up in front of themselves, that will somehow be the clavis magnum, the great key that resolves everything. And it never fucking works. And it's out of it's a kind of existential laziness, where they're like, just give me the one rule that I can remember. Oh, they should always have a choice. Oh, okay, that's the one rule. No, the one rule is take all of it on a case-by-case basis. Because if I had a kid and I said, perhaps it might happen. As some of my friends tell me, they're like, well, and Anthony Quinn had kids in his 80s. And I'm like, yeah, he was rich. He was a fucking movie star. I'm not. We'll see, though. We'll see. If you had a kid that was properly responsive, and you could tell that by extending the rope, they didn't just hang themselves with it, right? They came up and they went, "Poop, cool, cat's cradle, dad," right? You'd be like, okay, I'll extend more. Is there enough responsibility and character present at this time that you can extend these things in order to teach them that self-reliance? But it's not a one size fits all thing. You know, if you want to raise a prince or whatever, if you want to raise someone who becomes the most of whatever it is that they seem to genuinely have within them as their kernel, you know, for how their gears are going to mesh with the world and get traction and do what only they can do. And if they don't do it, it'll never happen because only they could do it, right? That's a high bar. Most people are just mouth breathing and drooling, granted. However, you look at it as though that's possible, and you test and you see. But just like with a date, same as with, like, if I went out on a date back in the day, I used to do this all the time. Go to an expensive restaurant with a woman to see how she's going to treat the wait staff, because you want to find out how a woman will treat those who she is confident are entirely within her power. So take her out, put the fucking One Ring in front of her, and see if she's a bitch to, or whatever. I don't want to get your channel in trouble. If she's an unpleasant person in some fashion or another.
Semiogogue, I think it's a little late for that. I mean, look, I've only been on this channel a month and a half, but I think that enough things have been said that Susan is not going to be too kind to me. So don't worry about it.
Good. So it's not just me. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. So you test and you can find out whether or not you're dealing with a deplorable person, because, you know, put someone within the power of a woman and then watch her very carefully to see how she gets with them. Now, it's not always going to be like, you know, she wants to send her dish back because it's not warm enough, some sort of Princess and the Pea Petty stuff. Sometimes it'll be the little game they start to play with the dual meaning of words as they're asking each other, like, oh, nice glasses, you know. See if that kind of shit starts, and then you'll see what the woman behaves like, and you'll see whether or not you're going to be stuck making mud pies or you might have gold. You know, likewise with children, I would imagine, you know, with my vast non-existent experience of child rearing behind me, it would seem that you look and see what you have. And if the child seems to have that ability or skill or can go in that direction, then take them there. But the general idea of always options, no. As I've gotten older, it's not just children that I want to say, it's because I said so, too. I feel that it's perfectly appropriate for me to say it to all ages and ranges of people. And as you two gentlemen will discover, I do not doubt, as you get older, you too will begin to just feel like saying, no, it's because I said so. You'll also probably find yourself very often saying things like, I will not be spoken to in this way. Goodbye, you know.
So Semiogogue, these are kind of linked questions for me, and this is a little bit of a shift. But I guess looking back, and maybe this is a pre-post internet thing, but at least in the last 100 years, you can look at a photo and you can date that photo within a couple years, right? You're like, oh, that's a 60s car. They're dressed like they're from the 60s. Or, oh, that's a 20s haircut. But that's kind of fallen apart in the last 15 or 20 years. So would you say that the culture of like recognizable decades is gone? And if so, when did you notice that?
Well, the short answer is that it's very much all being processed and reprocessed to produce what in some contexts you can call a pastiche, you know, a clever dissembling representation of something designed to look as though it was older and made in this particular style. But they always get it fucking wrong because they weren't there. You can't blame anybody. I mean, I'm sure when I was dressing up in my 3-button suit, some 60s guy'd cruise by and be like, oh, what the fuck are you doing? You know? But yeah, there is a sense that it is being plowed back under. There is a sense that it is, like I talked about, dogs eating their own vomit, the nostalgia aspect. But I think that there's something much more important that's going on, which is that nothing, for all that everybody likes to talk about phenomena that are emergent, it so seldom is that it's entirely the opposite. So you talked earlier about that dark phase, and I wanted to mention this then, but it fits here as well. Where it was, go off, do your own thing, go west, young man, kill the dragon, save the maiden, get a castle, do your thing. One day you too will be a lord of a manor. That whole thing of exploring, even collectively as a generation, and coming up with your own answers, it was ending by the time that I was about like 16. And by 17, 18, certainly by the time I was 21, it was over. So like what I mean by that is that for like hardcore music and stuff, you'd have 7 inches, right? So you had a whole area of music where these people really did get together with some small time dude within a particular city who had a setup to produce little 7-inch vinyl. And you could produce your own and stick a label on it. You had your own record label and you were somebody. And it was yours. So all kinds of, Youth Brigade, Minor Threat, all this shit. They were turning out all these, all this music, and some of them said, no, we don't want to do drugs, and said we're straight edge, and put an X on the back of their hands. Other ones were, like fucking crass and all that, commie bullshit. But everyone was doing their sort of genuine thing. And also before the internet happened, we were still networking, and I was very much involved in that. You had fax machines. You had things like Fact Sheet 5, where you produced this stuff in the form of pamphlets, and everybody kept up these crazy, not everybody, but a lot of people, and I was among them, kept up really intense correspondences where you'd go to the P.O. box daily and pull out all this stuff, and you'd run your own zine. And that was before the internet, but it was copy machines, fax machines. That's what made that possible, in the postal service. And so people were genuinely trying to reach out there and make their cultural imprint. And what happened is, I guess the beast rose up out of the muck and learned how to grab it and eat it and digest it faster than we had ever seen before. So it almost, and I used to joke about this, it almost became a thing by the time I was approaching 20, where probably by 21, 22, then it was going away. Basically, when you started hearing about alternative, when someone on the radio said alternative,
Capital A alternative. Yeah.
and it wasn't like a little low rent university radio station where different students, were DJs and did their pet thing. By that time, it was disappearing. What I'm getting at here is that somehow the marketing beast learned how to identify and seize and digest and puke up their own packaged version of whatever it is that you had genuinely tried to pull out of your heart of hearts and like express. They could do it so quickly. I don't know that there's anything more subversive for an entire generation than having every individual and collective product that you produced seized by the demon and then puked back up at you in, big, fat, friendly, puffy letters. And it happened fast. And I tend to think that the self-destruction, the whole thing of like the Gen X flannel shirt wearing sub pop, like you were talking about Soundgarden and Nirvana and, these other bands from the Pacific Northwest, leaving aside ones like, what's his name? Jeremy Spoken.
Eddie Vedder.
Yeah, that I fucking hated that band. Good for them for going after Ticketmaster, but they fucking made me want to puke. Stone Temple Pilots, which seemed to be a copy of them, they were actually better. And I tend to think, actually, these days, I'm more of the opinion that Sabbath was some kind of copy of Led Zeppelin that was actually just better because it had its own more unique sound. But anyway, that's a side note.
You're about to make Ace mad. Yeah. Let's not get into that.
Huge.
All right.
Huge rift.
Well, yes. Well, hey, we will, between Men of Goodwill, all differences are small. You and I agree that Sabotage was a peak and that the first 6 albums, We're among the best. Yes. Anyway, the point is that somehow I think that self-destructive heroin use and all that came out of that musical scene, I think that was the reaction of my generation to having its expressions stolen. The only remaining, it's like Gigi Allen, I mean, he came and played a bunch of times at the club I worked at, and everybody was, joking about how he was going to kill himself, and we're like, oh, we'll see. Or like Genesis P-Orridge cutting his shit off, and everyone sort of turned their own horrific self-destruction into their art school final submission. And so the only act of rebellion that remained for a generation that had everything it tried to produce rebelliously seized and puked back up and repackaged was to destroy themselves. And I think that I mean, we're kind of seeing it now in a way that's even, I mean, it's weird to talk about something as fucked up and sick as that and then be like, this new thing that they got. Yeah. It's like, it's exponentially more sick and fucked up, where they think they're rebelling, but they never even had their own expression. They didn't. Yeah.
And
Anyway,
not to consistently go back to Ted Kaczynski, but he has a great essay about this called "The System's Greatest Trick," that is essentially describing that exact process. And to me, and this is a stupid thing, right? Like, this is a silly musical movement, but I feel like the movement that describes this best is pop punk, right? Like the Bush era, fist in the air,
Green
American
Day.
Idiot. Right, exactly. Which, looking back on, I don't understand, because it is so transparently like the corporate mask of rebellion, right? Like, it's the guy who buys a V from Vendetta mask from Amazon, and gets it shipped with 2-day prime shipping. It's like even rebellion is now a packaged product, if that makes sense.
I think all that happened around about the time that you could buy your jeans pre-distressed. It just was all fucking horrifying. I mean, it almost makes me want to go back to Stonewashed as being like this era where it was, it was all packaged and kind of vile. I remember I'd moved to San Francisco by that point. There were, in a smaller city like I was in, the cool kids, they were supposed to go somewhere else and get wise in the new place, and there were some who went to New York, tried going there, and it always made me sick. Steam coming out of the ground, noise above me, noise below me. Everybody sounds like the dogs when they talk. I was, and then, well, then you must go to LA. And I was like, no, I went to LA. It was fun to chase the women there. And then, it's you're fucked when you catch one. And then, I decided, well, no, literary and writing and the West Coast, and I'll go off to San Francisco, and, when I got there, it was, it was this starting to be that whole Green Day thing, as well as all the grunge stuff. And all of it died. There was a huge, awesome efflorescence of independent music that rolled. I mean, and a bunch of them became popular later, like, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, or The Birthday Party, or what's her name? Fuck with the giant nose who sings like a little fucking mad angel, PJ Harvey. A lot of those people were coming up, and I got to see a lot of them play live, and they did their thing. And it was fucking cool. And then there was a whole subgenre. You can check on my channel. I talked with the guy who was into it, who's out of Germany. All the occult sort of underground stuff. So everything from Death in June to Throbbing Gristle, Industrial to Crash Worship, Current 93, Nurse with Wound, Coil. There was that whole vibe too. And the last gasp of that was people like Reznor trying to connect to who had come before him. So he would have Gary Newman on stage. Dee and I were talking about this recently. And he also went back and tried to do some stuff producing Coil's albums. But all of that kind of, Reznor was the last one who kind of came up with something that was his own style, and got big, having come up sort of honestly. I don't know what the behind the scenes story is. You had people like Wax Trax and Al Jurgensen out of Chicago and the rest. So where would that be? That would be around like the first 16 horsepower albums were still all badass. But then, yeah, by 2006, 2007, it was all going away, and it was looking bad by 90. I mean, it took from about 92 to about 2002 to totally kind of crap out, in my view. But I just stopped listening to stuff. Like the last band I ever paid any attention to was Radiohead. You know, I'm sure that could be controversial, but whatever's going on with them, they had some musical talent.
So I'll be honest, my endurance is failing, so we're gonna have to wrap this up sooner or later. But I'm gonna pass this one to you, Ace, and then Oliver after that. But what do you think is the correct way to approach some kind of like Gen X, Gen Z bridge? Like what are the points of common contact there?
Yeah, it's gonna be tough. I'm starting to think that we're gonna have to use some of that Gen X worth ethic to even survive and to make Gen Z a lot less cringe. So it's a mix of both. We want to overcome the cynicism, but we also need them to get up in the morning. So I don't know. It's tough, because I think a lot of our, everything from comedy to the Valley Girls and even some of our parents, they're still stuck in this mental quicksand of Gen X, and so we're gonna have to find our own identity that they haven't robbed us of yet. And so I'm listing a lot of barriers to overcome mostly, but it's just gonna have to be some introspection on both of our generations because we both lack the identity. But I guess sort of trying to get as close to the boomers as we can since it's basically been downhill since. We're just gonna have to like cope together and kind of synthesize something out of that.
See, then cope.
Exactly. We're gonna have to sneed and cope together, and so that'll come into something.
Well, sneed is actually an interesting bridge because here's where I think it is. I think that there's actually a lot more in common with the Gen Z and the Gen X sense of humor. And obviously,
True.
like the very, very bizarre, like highly surreal Zoomer humor that even I look at and just kind of feel like I'm in a foreign country, where it's just a horribly distorted picture of the letter E, and somehow that's humor.
That's us. That's us,
Yeah,
man.
really,
You
right? I
separate
can't deny that. But I look at kind of those like comedy touchstones of that era, and maybe it's just that that's how I was raised. That's what my parents thought was funny. But there is some type of commonality, and maybe it's just the banter culture that was kind of more common in kind of the real world that kind of reemerged artificially to a certain degree on the internet. But I do kind of notice there's some kind of crossover in humor that at least the comedy of the past that I find funny is Gen X humor. And maybe that's personal, maybe it's not. But do you have any opinions on that? Either just like on the humor or on some kind of like crossover, Oliver?
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point that I hadn't really thought about. Y'all shit is funny. And I have not been able to laugh at a comedian since like Carlin died. And Carlin's, got all kinds of boomer pause and all kinds of things like that. I'm not trying to, however, he said a bunch of shit that that he believed and didn't care whether or not, the powers that be liked it. Some of it doubtless suited their ends. Others of it, he brought up some uncomfortable things. Anyway, yeah, I think the humor really does connect because our big thing was totally cryptic stickers. So I was hanging out with all the art school kids and we just went to Kinko's and produced badass stickers. So like one of my favorite ones, my friend took Linus and Pigpen or Charlie Brown and Pigpen or something, and he had one of them just sitting there with like a fucked up scribbled black cloud over his head, and then he took the other one and changed his face and just put a unicursal hexagram from Crowley in it, and then underneath he had the caption be, "Anyway, I guess I'll just go homo." Like all kinds of weird, all kinds of just weird, don't know where the fuck it's coming from. You're not supposed to know exactly where it's coming from. It's supposed to be your own kind of little Zen moment where you ride the wave of chaos as you consider the potential signification and then just fucking laugh. And when I came back from Turkey the first time, I couldn't talk to nobody was fucking funny and everyone wanted to like morally police me. It freaked me out, man. Everyone, they were all freaks. They were constantly trying to police what I wasn't allowed to do. And then I started trying to watch comedy, and just like, another black comedian's going to do a white guy voice, and I was like, what the fuck am I watching, and that has changed. I think you hammered it, Jack. The point is a good one. I can see the humor in that. I know people like AA, who's only sort of a titular, Gen Xer. Some of his stuff, his humor works for me, and I think he has some appeal to the Zoomer, and the Zoomers certainly have appeal to him and to me. Like, there is a whole thing of like, fuck you, I don't care if you get it. That's the whole point. Fuck you.
Right. Yeah. That's why it's funny. It's funny because you don't understand it.
Right. And that's the beautiful thing is y'all motherfuckers will laugh at anything.
That's true.
I'll do it in private, but y'all will do it in public. Sorry, you were muted, Ace.
No, I'm just saying that is funny. So you're right. That is true.
So and maybe there's some kind of deeply buried white pill in that. I'll contest that Carlin was the last funny comedian, because I think the last funny comedian just died. I think Norm Macdonald was the last truly funny comedian.
He was. He had his moments for sure.
But I think there's something, and this is maybe too much of a philosophical idea to kind of bring up right at the end of a show. But I think there's something about humor that, like, there kind of has to be a note of truth in it, Like, it's what we say about lefty memes, where there's just a wall of text. You need all of that to make it funny. It's not funny based off of kind of common sense. You have to put yourself in a different world to laugh at it. But I think that if we consider ourselves like whatever on the right, kind of the side of truth, what, like, comedy's working for us. And Ace and I have kind of been talking about returning to that kind of like that era of zines and stickers, and kind of making this fun and countercultural. And obviously it's funny in a gallows humor way. Like, we're kind of fucked, And I mean, you're headed for your fifth once in a lifetime economic collapse, Things aren't, from certain perspectives, looking good. But it's also it's hard to get people up in the morning with "you're all going to die," But if you have that kind of gallows humor about it, maybe that's the way. Maybe not the panacea, right? Maybe not the universal key you were talking about, but it sure is something, right?
I like it because I now have some shit to laugh at. I can get up in the morning and, come into the office and turn on Twitter and check the various social media accounts. And, there's a bunch of dreck, some of which I've produced, but there's some good ones. And, at least twice a week, there's some badass meme that you're like, oh, that gives me hope. Somewhere is somebody bent enough, all crooked as a dog's hind leg, to think that was funny. I'm not alone. So yeah, that part's good. I would ask you, I know you want to wrap, but can I just ask both of you what your or Gen Z's biggest problems with Gen X are? I don't know if that's too long. I don't mean to like seize control of your stream, but it seems
not at all
worthwhile to hear. Like, what do you guys hate the most, or what do you think the biggest problem is?
You go first, Jack. I want you to set the tone.
So, and maybe I kind of showed my hand here, which is that there's this attitude that drives me up the wall, right? And you see this actually in millennials and and maybe it's just like a broader problem with our culture, but it's the idea that no matter what I do, I'm still a rebel. You know what? Like, I'm still blazing my own path as I drive down the road listening to NPR in my leased car with a resist sticker on the back. It's like, I'm still cool. I'm still with it. And look, like, I kind of reject cool past a certain point, and I think that that's kind of an artificial construct. But there's another part of me that looks at it and it's like, dude, you're growing up. Just recognize it. You know what? Like, you don't have to still be fighting the man, listening to Rage Against the Machine as, you drive into your corporate job. Like, just accept it and move on. And maybe that kind of attitude of like artificial eternal rebellion that, at least in some ways, is kind of characterized by Gen X. And actually, the perfect example of this is, do you guys remember, this was like the horrible Republican swamp creature, Matt Ryan? He was was he Speaker of the House? I can't remember, but he kind of got ousted with Trump. He was some, like reprobate Republican senator. But I'll never forget, I was pretty young at the time, but he got asked by some generic talk show, you know, what's your favorite music? Like, what do you listen to? And I kid you not, he said Rage Against the Machine. And I just remember even as a kid, I was like, what are you doing, man? You are the machine. You know what I mean? You are a House Majority Leader. I can't remember what position it was. It was something like that, right? Fighting Obama as a Republican, listening to, you know, the guy who's talking about arm the homeless. Like, what's wrong with you? And I guess that attitude is something I find irritating. And it's not universal to Gen X, but it's something I see often. So you can go now, Ace.
Yeah, I'm going to double down with your point, Jack. Just like you said, the rebellion, I mean, the 60s and the 90s being the same decade and not getting past the 20th century in general, that's my biggest critique against them. I mean, to go back to what we said earlier, Woodstock 99 is the inevitable result of the 60s Woodstock. The you know, people don't seem to think of the violent nature of the 90s, you know, existing in a vacuum, but the hippies encountered, you know, some of the most destructive stuff, the Rolling Stones Altamont concert, just all the crazy decadent stuff that was happening in the 60s. Of course it's going to lead to something like Woodstock 99 and this kind of separation, or you know, the hippies being this non-violent generation. I just feel like that just keeps perpetuating itself through Gen X, and it's being forced into a lot of Gen Z into thinking that we can still carry that pattern forward, because it's not going to lead to any more decadence. So it's just the repetitive nature of the 20th century refusing to get past it is what's frustrating.
Well, from our perspective, I guess this will be the final confession, where the confession of Generation X. I had a very difficult time one time. Fell very in love with a woman, and it all went like fucking, just all turned into a mess. And I was like, you know what? I am done with this. I am done with this. Had nice long hair, so I just said, screw this. I'm doing my monk thing. Shaved my whole head. Said, I am done with the feminine. Remove me from this world. I'm going to walk the straight path now. And I remember that woman came up to me, and she got me to be wary of a woman who's very intelligent and also very hot. I remember she came up to me afterwards, and she was like, you know, I had another boyfriend do that. and when you have, and she meant it. It had happened, you know, and it was delivered just like that. And you're thinking to yourself, my path, my rebellion, I will do this in reaction, and this is my way. And suddenly you're just like, you know, I'm a fuck up. The feeling that touched me in my Gen X spot that's covered by my bathing suit, right? That went straight and violated every sense of how I'm a unique and special snowflake. And what subsequently followed a good number of years later was that I had to confront all this stuff in terms of red pill, right? And what had been going on and whether I knew it or not. And I definitely was not over in blue pilled land, but I had whole heaps of shit I had to sort out. And, you know, you can even go look at my old content and see me, right? There's a bunch of that I had to figure out and deal with. And the process of doing that, in terms of your whole thing about, like, you know, Gen X and their sense that they're going to be rebels forever. I had to realize, oh God, this is just everything that I thought was unique about me is just like that time my fucking ex-girlfriend came up and said, oh yeah, last boyfriend shaved his head just like that to teach me a lesson. And I was like, the fuck? Like, I'm really, like, not only am I not the most unique thing that ever existed on earth, but I'm actually stamped by a fucking cookie cutter. Like, there's an almost schizophrenia inducing thing that you have to confront if you want to overcome that self-image vis-a-vis what's actually there. And so I'm just here to tell you, gentlemen, that given enough honesty, there are Gen Xers out there whose streak of rebelliousness is real enough that if it is paired with honesty, they can come back as an entirely different kind of rebel that hopefully would be a little bit less tedious. But I don't think you're going to see a lot of it, to be honest with you, because it's a feeling just like, oh yeah, you cut your hair too. You're like, it's just someone stomped a mud hole in your ass and walked it dry. It's just like over your psyche just breaks. You're what? I'm not special. So yeah, I would not write all of us off, but
Well, and that was not my intention. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, if we're talking about which generation is irritating and largely ruined, I mean, we could talk for 4 hours about what's wrong with the Zoomers, as some have, right?
yeah, I
But
think
I think
millennials
that,
might be worse. But yeah.
yeah, well, you're probably right on that one. But anyway, I've got to hit the gym before I'm up early tomorrow. So can we get our plugs out of the way and then we can end this thing? It's all right, Oliver. If people
Yeah.
don't know where you are you?
You can find me on mainly on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Telegram. You can find me on Odyssey, and you can find me on what's that awful one? BitChute. God help you. Yeah, just follow my buddies like Radlib, who gave a plug, I think, to this show before it happened. Follow Academic Agent. And if you guys are over from my side of things and watching, definitely give Jay Burden a follow. Also, Ace, he has had Thomas 77 on a number of times, had some great discussions, and he also has some great stuff he runs by himself. So yeah, that's my plug, my crew, and my peeps.
Awesome.
Right.
Well, thank you, Oliver, for the plug. But my stuff is found at Aaron Ryder AC at Twitter, Loud Sound Epicenter at YouTube, and then the Substack is, I think, aaroncummings.substack, something like that. So that's all my stuff.
Well, thank you guys both for coming on. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. I have Panama Hat coming on Tuesday, a little earlier than this time slot, but that should be a really good one. We're going to be talking about the aristocratic temperament. And then after that, I've got one of the guys from Oros's Discord to talk about personal fitness. And then after that, I haven't planned that far in advance, so hopefully something else. But anyway, thank you, gentlemen, both for coming on. I really enjoyed it. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever.